MOU implementation training workshop. This will be the same as the training we held yesterday morning. So if you attended that training, feel free to jump off unless you just liked it so much that you wanted to attend a second time, and you are more than welcome to stick around. First up, I'm going to hand it over to Clover Clemens, the NRM section director, to go over some kind of course introduction and housekeeping items. Clover?
Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. I just want to say thank you for joining us. And Matt, if you could go ahead and move to the next slide. Just as a reminder, we are working in the WebEx environment today instead of Teams, so you should see your meeting controls across the bottom of the screen. And also, if you want to change your layout up at the top of the screen, turn on and off your chat window, see who else is in the lovely list of participants. I'm going to remind everybody to please mute yourself just and stay that way unless you need to ask a question. We will be monitoring the chat window, so you're welcome to use that or raise your hand. Either one will work, and then we can go from there. As far as the meeting itself, go ahead and to the next slide. There we go. There's your control buttons. Also, we are going to be recording this presentation, and it would be very helpful to keep your cameras off unless you're speaking or asking a question. And then again, like I said, raise your hand or turn on the chat window and type in your question if you would like to ask a question. Beyond that, we would like to make sure that everyone understands how to go in from the TxDOT side and record your training for this. So I'm going to share my screen briefly and show you how to do that. Screen 2, here we go. Right, so you should be seeing what everybody sees when you log into PeopleSoft. There are several tiles. A little welcome message at the top. If you scroll down, you can see it. Okay. Need some help with muting. Thank you. All right. You should see a tile that says supplemental learning. If you select that tile, it will take you to some drop-down menus. You can select the type of training. In this case, we're talking environmental. Then you would select add supplemental learning, type in the title, species analysis, and it helps to be able to type TPWD-MOU. Anyway, you give it a brief description. Your status here, I believe most of you should be, your status would be submit for approval. The date of the training, location would be virtual WebEx, and then provided by would be text.env NRM, or just text.env is fine. And then once you've got all this information in, you can just hit save, and that will send an email to your supervisor. All they have to do on their end, they'll get a little note that it needs to be approved. Once it's approved, then it's added to your text.elm training record. So then it would appear under My Learning right here in this tab once it's approved. So we don't have, Brian Ellis is retiring. He used to do this for us. We all have the tools to do it ourselves a whole lot easier now than we used to with the most recent refresh of PeopleSoft. So that's how you do it. Hopefully that makes sense. And if you have any questions about that, please let us know. And I'll stop sharing my screen. All right. Last but not least, just a quick safety minute. This one's a personal pet peeve of mine. And just a reminder to everybody that it is the law in Texas to move over a lane if that is possible, and if that is not possible, to slow to 20 miles an hour below the posted speed limit if there is a vehicle on the side of the road with appropriate flashers on, and that means any vehicle, TxDOT vehicle, construction vehicle, police, wrecker, anything of that matter. It's to give them the space that they need to safely do whatever it is that they're doing on the side of the road. Just remember, it is the law. And if you violate it, you may be fined accordingly. Just keep everybody safe out there, please. All right. As far as your presenters today, hi, I'm Clover. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the section director of natural resources within the Environmental Affairs Division. I'm coming to you live today from my house out in Hays County, Texas, south and west of Austin. I've been with TxDOT a little over 3.5 years, and I bring with me about 20 years of consulting experience, and about 12 of that was directly for TxDOT as a biological services contractor. So that's kind of what allows me to speak TxDOT-ese a little bit better. My background, my degrees are both in geology. I have a bachelor's from James Madison in Virginia and a master's from Baylor University. Most of my experience and work has been in near surface geology and karst. And in my spare time, I spend a lot of time with my chickens and my cats and my rescued sulcata tortoise that lives in my backyard. And when they're not keeping me entertained, then my 17-year-old daughter that's a senior in high school certainly is. So that's what I do when I'm not working. All right, next up we have Sterling. And Sterling is our biology team lead. He is stationed out in Lubbock, Texas, and he has been with TxDOT for quite some time now. He's assigned to most of our western districts. He received his bachelor's and master's from Texas A&M University in wildlife and fisheries science with a focus on molecular evolution of turtles, bats, and bears. He received his PhD in biology from the Florida Institute of Technology in 2003 with work on the evolutionary relationships of tarpon, ladyfish, and bonefish. And he's worked in academia, environmental consulting, industry, and government for the last 27 years. With TxDOT, he has the responsibility for ensuring that our transportation and infrastructure projects are developed in an environmentally sound manner, and he mainly focuses on herps, turtles and salamanders, bats, and karst invertebrates. And then last but not least, sorry about that. I did something on my end. We've got Matt Buckingham. Matt is no longer the newest addition to our biology team, but he is stationed over in Lufkin, deep in the Piney Woods. He is the E&V biologist assigned to the Atlanta, Lufkin, Paris, and Tyler districts, and will be taking on Fort Worth district at the beginning of September. Matt obtained his bachelor's in wildlife management and his master's in biology from Stephen F. Austin State University, and he's worked with state and federal agencies and nonprofit conservation organizations on efforts and research projects examining a broad range of topics, including population biology of inland American alligators, nesting dynamics of snowy plovers, habitat selection by neotropical migrant birds, and population densities of salt marsh bird species. Matt is particularly interested in plant communities, birds, and amphibian ecology. In his free time, Matt can be found spending time out in nature. Surprise! He enjoys camping, hiking, backpacking, and most of all, nature photography. And we're going to be blessed with a lot of photos from Matt's traipses through nature. We get to see those on a regular basis after he takes trips. He downloads a whole bunch of interesting and new pictures, and those are going to be featured throughout this presentation. All right. Oh, I get to keep talking. All right. The importance of quality documentation. I just wanted to talk a little bit about this is the why of what we do, and we're going to throw some of Matt's beautiful photography up there to keep you entertained in the background, lull you into submission. Um, the the why of what we do, a lot of this is, it's the right thing to do, but also it stems from a lot of it from our NEPA assignment. We've done it forever and ever, but it became especially important after that, once the delegation came down from Federal Highway Administration, from TxDOT, to act as the lead federal agency. TxDOT became responsible for complying with all those regulations and liable for all of the decisions that we make under NEPA. So the documentation that we do in support of our NEPA decisions is extremely important to shoring up all of those NEPA decisions as we move forward. TxDOT spent a lot of time before and during NEPA assignment developing that internal guidance and external guidance for that matter, and building in checks and balances to review documentation, review the information that's prepared for our projects. So NRM does this monthly. We randomly select 10 projects that have cleared to review the documentation where all no effect determinations have been made for all species. In our reviews, sometimes we find issues and we'll follow up directly with district staff and make suggestions for moving forward or fixing the documentation if need be. And also the project review team within E&V performs some comprehensive reviews of our ECOS documentation once projects have cleared. And we work directly with PR to address issues whenever there are concerns about water or biology documentation. So the point of those is to make sure that the documentation is complete, correct, and doesn't conflict. And that's a big part of it. So we see a lot of conflict in our documentation when we will say in one part of the documentation, we may say no effect. And then elsewhere in the documentation, we indicate that there is an effect and we take some kind of action as a result of that. So, for example, for projects not federally funded and has no federal nexus, the documentation makes a may affect call. That's kind of your first trigger because that's not necessarily an appropriate call for a project with a federal nexus. So that kind of that triggers to us. And then further, maybe that programmatic consultation is used to address that may affect call. Well, programmatic consultations only apply when there's federal funding with a Section 7 nexus. So those things then become in conflict. When we see BMPs that are used or conservation measures that are taken when there are no effect calls. Those are the kinds of things that we need to make sure that if you're early on in the process and you've decided one thing and later on you change your mind and do something else, that all of the documentation matches when it's time to clear the project or time to finalize the environmental document. So that good documentation is absolutely critical to supporting that NEPA decision to keep us away from being in a legal challenge situation. We have been, we are currently, and we will be continued to be challenged based on our decisions. In my very short time at TxDOT, I've been involved in 3 legal challenges of our NEPA and Endangered Species Act compliance. For 2 of those, we've been able to weather the challenge and be successful. And a lot of that is based on good decisions and good documentation. So I hope that will be the case moving forward with future legal challenges. So that thorough documentation takes time. It takes training. That's why we're here today. It takes development of expertise, also why we're here today. It takes a lot of review and comment back and forth. We take what we've done, revise it to make it better, and we have to learn from that process. And that's one of the most important things that environmental professionals can offer each other. That's how I got to where I am. Everybody starts somewhere. You give it a try. You make mistakes. Everybody does. You get schooled, you get mentored. You improve with each iteration, and that's the whole point here. So please take advantage of working with species leads, with natural resources staff here at E&V to provide reviews of your documentation, but please learn and grow from their input. Making similar mistakes over and over is also a challenge. We want to make sure that we try to do it right the first time, learn and apply that in the future. All right. Good documentation is also a large part of how we got to where we are with our regulatory relationships. It's super important that we are doing the right thing and show that we're doing the right thing, have those processes in place, and that gives those regulatory entities a lot more assurance to support the decisions that we're making. So in the case of species, with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they know good documentation when they see it. And the reason we are where we are with the MOU stems from TPWD trusting TxDOT to have the procedures in place, to have that documentation to support analysis of our impacts to species. So that's the why behind the training today, and also hopefully carry that forward as in your work with species analysis.
Thank you, Clover. We're going to switch gears a little bit and get into the meat of the species analysis training. And really, any species analysis starts with that initial review of resources, including some background desktop reviews that are done prior to a field visit, and the actual field visits themselves, the visit or visits, depending on the situation of your particular project, are crucial in developing some of these determinations and documentations. And to get into the importance of this and some new guidance that we're working on, I'm going to pass things over to our team lead, Sterling Robertson.
All right, thanks, Matt. You can put on the Flickr scroll. There we go. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So what Clover was just talking about in terms of developing trust with our regulatory agencies, and in this case, in particular, TPWD, is extremely important. We've spent years developing the relationship, and and that relationship has led us to this new MOU that we're going to discuss in more detail later on. And also the species analysis spreadsheet, which is the central topic of this training today. But the species analysis spreadsheet is kind of at the end of the process. How can you possibly fill out all of those, make those determinations and fill out that spreadsheet without having done the background work to make sure that you understand what the natural setting is and what the potential project impacts to that natural setting are. So as part of that trust that we've developed with Parks and Wildlife that let us get this MOU, we are now in a relationship with Parks and Wildlife where it is more of a partnership rather than them providing some type of oversight function as they have done in the past. And so that means that we are in control of our program. We've demonstrated that we have the skills and ability to develop a fully functioning natural resources program. Our partners trust that we are the experts in transportation ecology, and so as part of that kind of paradigm shift, we in NRM have been focusing more and more on developing guidance documents that will be part of the toolkit so that everybody knows, what the expectations are, excuse me, and has a place to go and get a copy of that guidance and know that this is the way that TxDOT is going to do business. So, like I said, we're going to do that with guidance and policy. And today I want to introduce you to a new guidance document. It was attached to the calendar appointment, and it's the guidance for conducting habitat assessments and presence absence surveys. Now, I should point out that this guidance that I'm going to show you today, and I'm just going to go through it at the 10,000 foot level, is still in draft form, meaning that the final guidance that gets published through the toolkit may be slightly different. But in whole, we don't expect any major changes. There may be some minor tweaks or some reorganization or something like that, but this is essentially what it's going to wind up being. So let me go over that with you. And one other component to this is that this guidance is for consultants, is for district environmental staff, and it's really guidance on how the biologist is going to evaluate the project. For those of you that are, very experienced biologists, this type of guidance is second nature to you. It's not going to probably add anything to the procedures that you would normally go through. But if you're district environmental staff and you're managing a consultant biologist, then this should be extremely useful guidance to you because you know what the expectations are from that consultant biologist who's out doing the field work for you in the desktop analysis and such and such. So it can be helpful as a key when you're trying to manage biological consultants. Also, I think it's a very, I tend to think of it as if I, as the senior biologist, were giving instructions to a new biologist on what I thought the starting point was for them being able to analyze habitat or to be able to set up the necessary steps in order to perform a presence absence survey, that this is something that you can, a short document that you can just say, this is how you do, this is where you start. And so having said that, let me go over this document with you. And Matt, I'm going to grab the screen away. Okay. So up on your screen right now is a bunch of words that constitute the new draft guidance document that will be available in the toolkit soon. And of course, you have a copy of the draft. And I'm just going to cover the high points so that you know the scope of what this document covers. And then we'll move on to the mechanics of the species analysis spreadsheet. So this is for protected and imperiled species. And, there's a lot of terms that are used to describe listed species, and then SGCNs and, such and such and such and such. So it gets complicated that way. So for the purposes of this document, we just say protected and imperiled species are all of these things. Everything listed by the services, everything that is candidate, everything that's on the Parks and Wildlife list, including SGCNs, bald and golden eagles, migratory birds, and other species considered rare or of conservation concern that may be of interest on a project by project basis. So that's what we mean when we say imperiled species in this context. So the other thing I really want to point out is this definition right here. Habitat assessments must be conducted by a qualified biologist. Well, what is a qualified biologist, you ask? Well, it's in the MOU and it's in the Texas Administrative Code and it's in this guidance. So a qualified biologist must have, at a minimum, a successful completion of a full 4-year course of study in an accredited college or university, leading to a bachelor's or higher degree with a major in biological sciences, natural resource management, wildlife science or management, ecology, zoology, botany, conservation biology, or a closely related field, and have experience relevant to that species, to the species, habitat, or ecosystems that are being studied or described. So that's the definition of who gets to do the habitat assessments and the presence absence surveys. You must be a qualified biologist. But I can hear district staff saying now, hey, Sterling, I don't meet that definition of a qualified biologist. How am I supposed to do my work? You need to hire a qualified biologist, and that can be through us. You can come to NRM, to whoever's assigned to your district. We can serve as that qualified biologist, or we can help contract qualified biologists using our scientific services contract. Another fairly common way that you get a qualified biologist on the job is as a sub on an engineering contract. Now, that's not our preference that it's done that way, because then you've got a prime in between you and the qualified biologist who's a sub. But it does get done that way, and the results are they're fine. It just sometimes takes a little while longer to get them to fine. But anyhow, in the case of your projects, you'll need a qualified biologist, and there's several different ways to get one, and that is part of our function here at NRM. So please reach out when you need our assistance. Now, the first part of conducting a habitat assessment is to do your desktop assessment. So you want to try to get as much information as you can about the project location, the project setting, and what you might expect to occur in that project, and therefore what impacts the projects might have on those species and habitats. So start that out with your desktop assessment, and here we give you a list of potential resources for you to use during that desktop assessment. This is certainly not a comprehensive list, but it is, again, a really good starting point. Next, you need to analyze the background data. So the data you gather in step one needs to be analyzed to determine whether the project area or surrounding areas contain potential habitat for protected and or imperiled species. And so, again, we give a list of resources of where you can find that type of species distribution information. Next thing to do is to identify the study area. So the study area is determined based on the project type and whether it's in the right of way, whether there be easements or not, whether it need additional right of way, and the habitats that surround that. And I'll just pause to say that habitat can exist in right of way even when it's mowed and maintained. So you can't just dismiss it because it's already existing right of way. You need to take a closer look. Next, you would develop your field maps. So these maps would have the data on there that you need to reference when you're in the field, so that you make sure that you have those data for when you're out in the field, and can be looking for those elements that you may have identified during the desktop assessment. Next step is to identify the equipment that you need, and this can be anything from PPE to GPS or range finders, cameras, notebooks, all that kind of stuff. And then finally, you need to get right of entry. So that's step 6, secure access to the study area. And of course, those of you who've worked with TxDOT or who work for TxDOT, you know that our right of entry requirements are ironclad. So important to remember that part. Next thing is you're getting ready to go out into the field. You need to be aware of field safety. TxDOT safety is always job one. So that we have some generalized safety recommendations for you, and also direct you to the E&V best management practices for field work, which is available on the toolkit webpage. So here's a list of common and general safety issues that we give you as examples. Again, not a comprehensive list. And ending with drink plenty of water. So then what do you do when it's time to go to the field? First thing is you get out to the field, you've got your right of entry, you've got all your gear, you've got your maps. Now it's time to identify and map vegetation and land cover types. Then you would characterize each vegetation type that you had mapped. And within that, identify any unusual vegetation and special habitat features, examples of which are given in this section. Again, not comprehensive. And then you need to determine or confirm if the habitat is actually present. So next phase after you've done that is the evaluation of potential project impacts. There's a series of steps to go through to depending on what you identified during your desktop and field assessments. And so here's a list of different things that you can do to determine what the potential project impacts are. And I think it goes without saying that you have to have a pretty good understanding of what the project is actually going to do. And that may mean not just what's in the plan set, but how something is going to be constructed. Because it's one thing to say in the plan set, remove this bridge pier. It could be quite a different impact in the way that the bridge pier is removed. Or, place additional pier here. Well, how is that going to be done? Is that going to be poured in place? Is it going to be augered in? Is it going to be pile driven? Do you need temporary access roads? Do you need haul roads? All those kind of things need to come into your thoughts when you're determining what the potential project impacts are, not just as it's designed, but as it's going to be built. So that moves on to the second phase of this guidance, which is conducting presence-absence surveys for protected and imperiled species. So this is different. So the first set there, we were talking about how do you do a habitat assessment, and that applies to every single project, with some extremely vanishingly rare exceptions, which we've covered in other training, where a district environmental staff decides or thinks that the impacts for this particular project are couldn't possibly have an effect on the biological resources. And then in consultation with the NRM staff member, if they come to an agreement, then we can waive the biology requirements for that particular project. And like I said, those situations are vanishingly rare, because they would be something like signals in a urban area, or plantings in a raised median, or ADA ramps, something like that. And in some of those cases, it's clear to everybody that there's no impact. But in a much more common scenario is you've done the habitat assessment and you've identified that it could have an impact to the species, in which case you may choose to conduct a presence absence surveys. The alternative to that is to assume that they're there, assume occupancy, and then we work from the worst case scenario. But if you did decide to do a presence absence survey, these would be the steps that you would need to go through in order to make sure you were doing it correctly. So you would determine the need, you would identify the appropriate survey protocols, and then you would conduct the surveys according to those protocols. In the end, you'll need a report for that survey, and here's what we consider to be the minimum documentation standards for a presence absence surveys for an imperiled species. And there's a list of those things. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the very short and minimum requirements for doing habitat assessments and performing presence absence surveys. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back over to Matt. Thank you. And I'll remind everybody, you can put questions in the chat box and we'll try to answer them as we go, informally, or there'll be time at the end of the presentation where we can have further discussion and answer questions then. But if you have questions that pop up at any time, go ahead and put them in the chat window and we'll pay attention to it. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Sterling, because I saw that we do have a hand up. So I'll give that person an opportunity to ask a question really quick, or just type it in the chat, and we can address it there. So, as we've heard, there are some exciting things coming to the world of TxDOT biology. We have a number of forthcoming guidance documents, and hopefully you received those on an update sent to this invitation yesterday. We're really hoping to have these go live around the first week of September. So the ones that you have received are in draft form. However, the substance is not likely to change. These have already been vetted. We're just kind of in the final stages of finalizing those and having them prepared to post on our toolkit. We're also going to be updating our species analysis form based on the new 2021 TPWD MOU, and we'll go over those changes in a moment here. And we have created a new form that's titled Documentation of Texas Parks and Wildlife Department Best Management Practices. This will become a part of the species analysis process for certain projects, and the Tier 1 site assessment will be going away. We will also be updating our Environmental Guide Volume 2 to correspond with some of these changes in our processes. Before we really get into these updates, I just wanted to go over some reminders, some important considerations, and things to keep in mind while completing the species analysis spreadsheet. And it's important to remember that the spreadsheet really is the cornerstone of our species analysis process. It conveys all of the information collected during these field visits, habitat assessments, presence-absence surveys, and any other analyses performed for a given project. And it provides justification for our effect and our impact determinations. And the first reminder I really want to give is always be sure that you're working from the most recent version of the spreadsheet. We've been updating the spreadsheet regularly. We've had a few updates this year, and this accounts for things like new listings, changes in distribution as identified by our regulatory agencies, updates in habitat descriptions, updates in taxonomy, updates in listing categories. So, species that go from candidate to listed or proposed listed to listed, species that are downlisted or delisted, things like that. So this is an ever-evolving document. We want to make sure that you guys are using the most recent one. And I'm just going to show you all quickly how to be sure you're doing that. If you go into Google and you just do a search for TxDOT environmental toolkits, the very first page, the very first search item that will come up is a link to our toolkits. And here you have a subheading, Natural Resources Toolkit. On that, and you scroll down to the third subheading here, State and Federal Protected Species. Your third item on here is a species analysis spreadsheet. It tells you the date it was updated. If you click that, it'll automatically download it to the folder of your choice, and then you can work from that. And I know many of y'all may have like a master set of canned responses for impact determinations or habitat determinations for similar type projects. And if you do that, it's easy enough to copy from an existing spreadsheet and put it to that one instead of using that old spreadsheet again. So we just request that you're downloading a brand new spreadsheet every time you're completing this analysis, or at least ensure that you're using the most recent version. The next consideration I'd like to discuss is the importance of the IPAC and the ARTEST lists. These lists should be obtained for every project that requires a species analysis, which those are most of the projects that we work on here. These should be cross-referenced against the spreadsheet to ensure that all protected species are accounted for. Please be sure that your species lists are less than 6 months old at the time of clearance. So things are moving very quickly, especially at the federal level now, which tends to happen during changes in administration. So we're getting almost weekly updates to things related to the Endangered Species Act. So we really need to be diligent to ensure that we don't miss anything. Here we try to stay on top of things. We pay attention to what's going on and react as quickly as we can. But we're not always informed. We hear about changes in listings or new species being listed and things like that. But Fish and Wildlife and TPWD, they both will update distribution for a species. And oftentimes we don't get informed of that until somebody actually takes a look and notices that there's a discrepancy between one of these lists and our spreadsheets. And so kind of double checking this each time you're using the spreadsheet in one of these lists, it acts as a fail-safe for us. So if you are doing this process and you notice, hey, I've got an IPAC for this county and this species is not on a spreadsheet, please email myself or the env-bio@txdot.gov email address, and that'll provide us, they'll again give us a heads up with what's going on, and we'll be able to adjust the spreadsheet or reach out to the agencies if necessary. Another important consideration, one that I think is paramount, is when you're completing the spreadsheet, please provide sufficient justification in both of the explanation tabs, in both of the explanation columns. You'll notice there's a column that requires an explanation for determination regarding suitable habitat, and there's another column for the explanation for effect and or impact determinations. One thing that we often see is simply stating suitable habitat is not present in that explanation for suitable habitat determination. And that's just not sufficient for that column. Remember, this spreadsheet is serving as our file of record for our determinations, and it should be documenting our thought processes thoroughly. And it should be including as much information as possible, including things like dates of site visits, dates of surveys, what the habitat on site looks like, how that differs, or how that's similar to the habitat requirements for a given species. When these files are reviewed, if they're reviewed, things like an audit or a legal action and things like that, many times the individuals reviewing this, they won't be biologists. They won't have a biology background. So this has to communicate this information very clearly and beyond a shadow of a doubt, so whoever's reviewing can say, okay, this is why they said that. Now, when you're in your explanation for effect or impacts determination, you may put suitable habitat is not present there if you thoroughly explained why that's the case in that suitable habitat column. That said, if there is suitable habitat in a project area and we're making a no effect or no impact determination, we need to provide a good explanation in that explanation column for effect or impact determination, and to really explain why we're making a no impact, no effect call. So just to give a quick example, if you have a situation where there may be perennial streams or other water bodies in a project area, but the nature of the project does not require work in the water, then that's a situation where we could say, yes, there's suitable habitat, but no, there will not be an impact to aquatic species because there'll be no work occurring in that water. And just an important reminder, there may have been, various guidances have been issued on this topic, but we cannot so we cannot just implement best management practices or voluntary conservation measures to get out of an effect or an impact determination. By the very nature, if we're saying we need to implement a BMP or a VCM, we're saying that these project activities could impact that species. Now, the BMP and the VCM may reduce those impacts to the point that they're negligible, but the reason we're implementing them is because our project could impact that species.
Hey, Matt.
Yes, sir.
You've got a question in the chat box, and the question is, can you discuss more about providing field assessment information in the species analysis spreadsheet?
Yeah, so why don't I pull up a spreadsheet real quick here. We'll just take a quick look at these columns. And I'm not going to get too into the weeds and the actual mechanics of the spreadsheet. We've had other trainings on that, and we have a new guidance document that is really going to get into the weeds there. But I'm just going to fill out this first part, and you just put in your information. On this tab, and this is what generates your species list. Two columns I'm talking about, you have this explanation for determination regarding suitable habitat and explanation for effect, take, and or impact determination. So this column here, explanation for determination regarding suitable habitat, is where you want to include information about the field assessment. So for example, if you had a plant species and you had, that species has a phrenology associated with it. It flowers at a certain time of year. Many species are really only detectable when they're flowering, or at least the probability that you'll detect them is best when they're flowering. So dates become really important for things like that. Or say you have bird species that are migratory and they'll be here in the summer vocalizing, nesting. That's when they can be detected. You might have, you might perform a mussel survey or something like that, and that's done when the water temperatures are at a certain level. So that's why it becomes important here to record things like the date of the field assessment. And then the other information, things like the condition or the nature of the habitat, the natural vegetative communities that are present, and how that differs from whatever the habitat requirements for that species are, or how it's similar. All of that information you're putting here in this explanation for determination regarding suitable habitat column. Hopefully that helps to answer that question.
And I'd say for more information, look at the draft guidance that was attached to the calendar appointment. That is the species analysis spreadsheet guidance.
And while I've got this spreadsheet open, I just want to draw attention here to the addendum tab. So like I said just a few moments ago, you may have a situation where the IPAC list shows a species that is not on the that shows a species that's not on the species analysis spreadsheet. This addendum tab is where you would record that. So the actual guidance will talk about how to populate these fields, but none of these cells are locked. So you'll enter the county, you'll enter your taxon, which that's like amphibians or birds or whatever it might be. Provide this information, provide habitat information, and once again, that guidance is going to discuss where to find good resources, how to find habitat information, and then you'll complete these columns the same you would on that species tab. So I just wanted to remind everybody that we have this addendum tab here as a tool.
And Matt, we have a couple other questions.
Okay.
Megan is asking about character limits in the species analysis spreadsheet.
So a couple things to look at there. And Megan, we can discuss this offline if you're having issues with that. I'm not aware of specific limits. I do know that based on the level of zoom that you're viewing the document for, like, so if you're not at 100% zoom when you're filling out or printing the document and you print it at, like, say 75% zoom, that will cut some the characters off for that cell. But if you're running into that issue, let's talk offline, and I'll try to look into it and see what the issue might be.
And the next question is from Jen Adams, who wants to know if they need to provide an explanation as to why we did not perform a presence absence survey if we have suitable habitat present. And the answer to that, Jen, is no. That hasn't changed.
Yeah, and you will have columns to record whether or not you did perform a presence absence survey and things like that. And you're certainly welcome to denote that there. But yeah, there's not an expectation or requirement to do that. And so we discussed the addendum tab. So please remember that that's a tool, and it's really our preference that you'll work from kind of a recent version or whatever version of the spreadsheet that you're using. If that species on the IPAC or ARTEST that you've noticed for that county is not on our spreadsheet, use the addendum tab to record an impact or effect determination for it. Monarchs, so unless you're really brand new to TxDOT, you've probably been a party to the discussion back and forth on monarchs. Monarch butterfly is a candidate species. There was a decision that listing for the monarch is warranted but precluded at this time, so it's not listed. It is a candidate, and there is no requirement to consult with Fish and Wildlife for a candidate species. Fortunately, TxDOT is a partner in the candidate conservation agreement for the monarch butterfly, and this covers this covers us for most of our project types. I'm not going to really get into the weeds on monarchs here because we've had a couple other presentations and discussions on this, but I do want to let y'all know on the environmental toolkit in that same state and federal protected species subheading, scroll down towards the bottom there, you have this guidance addressing the monarch butterfly in a text.species analysis. And this guidance document actually goes through what to do for various project scenarios and how to record a determination for monarchs and the language to use and all of that. That's all included in this guidance document. One thing that will be in the new species analysis guidance that hasn't really been detailed in previous guidance documents is our detailed instructions on how to perform a species analysis for a reevaluation. And this it's similar to the process that we currently use, but we're just really outlining it here for the first time. And I'm just going to run over some of the highlights really quickly here. The first thing we need to determine is that if there are changes to the project that could impact protected species. So some examples of this could include the addition of new right-of-way that was not previously evaluated, any new ground disturbing or vegetation clearing activities, new impacts to streams or other water bodies, and changes in construction timing, duration, things like that that could impact our determinations or any commitments that we've made with regulatory agencies. There are other examples too, but this is just to give you an idea of the types of things that might require an updated species analysis. To be able to make this determination, we really need to know if any new federal or state listed species have been added by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or Texas Parks and Wildlife. So this means that we'll need to obtain new IPAC and ARTES lists. So after this kind of initial analysis, if it's determined that the changes in the project could impact protected species, then an entire new performed species analysis activity should be created and completed based on the species analysis spreadsheet guidance and the environmental guide volume 2. So you just basically you're doing the analysis over, and we're justifying new effect or impact determinations. But if it's determined through these kind of analyses that there would be no impact to protected species, the lists, they still need to be obtained and they should be uploaded to the perform reevaluation activity. And text to the effect that there would be no new impacts to protected species should be added to the comment field of that activity. And the specific language to use and more information on this process, they'll be provided in the new species analysis spreadsheet guidance document, and that was attached to the invitation yesterday, as well as the updates to the environmental guide volume 2. And when in doubt, please just get with us, contact your NRN biologist or ENV Bio, get with us. We can discuss this with y'all, walk you through the process, help you, determine any of these things. If you're not comfortable making that determination yourself, we're more than happy to work through that with you. And one final note is I want to go over what to do to request an ENV review of a species analysis activity. This is an optional process. You're not required to have us take a look at it, but we are more than happy to do so. Please never think that we're too busy or the project's too insignificant, whatever. If you ever have something that you want to get a second pair of eyes on it, even if you're an old hand and you're confident in your abilities, it always helps to have a second pair of eyes take a look at this documentation to make sure that nothing was missed and that everything is adequately addressed. So if you do want to request a review, please ensure that all documents associated with the performed species analysis activity, that they're uploaded into ECOS and that they're in their native format. So for example, the species analysis spreadsheet for review should be an Excel file. And at the beginning of all those file names, please put draft so we know exactly which documents to look at during our review. And these instructions on what documents are required for species analysis, once again, and how to request this review, that's going to be in the environmental guide volume 2, and that will be updated soon to account for some of these changes in our processes and the new TPWD MOU. And that's all I have. Do we have any quick questions now before we take a break? And if not, we're going to take a 10-minute break and we're going to come back and talk about the new MOU.
Matt, there's nothing new in the chat box.
All right. Well, I've got 2:55. Let's meet back here at 3:05, and we'll talk about exciting new updates to our relationship with Texas Parks and Wildlife. Okay, I've got 305. We're going to switch gears now and start talking about the 2021 TxDOT TPWD MOU, which should be taking effect very soon here. I know Clover's excited to tell you about this, so I'm going to pass things back over to Clover to introduce some of the changes here in our relationship with Parks and Wildlife.
So many mute buttons. So much fun. All right. So just to give you guys a quick update on where things stand with the MOU. The MOU was adopted by the Texas Transportation Commission in June. It is now available in as codified at 43 Texas Administrative Code Part 1, Chapter 2, Subchapter G, Sections 2.201 through 207. I'm going to put in the chat that link that's displayed up on the screen so you guys can all go read the actual text of the MOU as codified at your leisure. So the next step is that the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department's commission is meeting tomorrow to adopt this by reference, essentially because it is part of our transportation code. We Texas Department of Transportation adopts it first, and then TPWD essentially adopts it by pointing to where it is in the regulations. So it's kind of that agency to agency handshake. So that is tomorrow. We have agreed amongst our agencies that the MOU will become effective at the beginning of the fiscal year, which is September 1st, which is next Wednesday. Yay! And there was much rejoicing. This is something that's been quite some time in the making, so we're very excited to see it finally moving forward. Some basic highlights of the MOU is the biggest change overall is that it applies only to projects with the environmental documentation classification of environmental assessment or environmental impact statement. So those are projects that have more likelihood of having impact, major construction projects. So that means that CE level projects that don't require that level of documentations are no longer required to be coordinated with TPWD. However, they may be coordinated with TPWD at the district's discretion. And that's a kind of a interesting way to come about this. But what we'd like for folks to do is to please hold any coordinations for CE level projects that are in preparation. In other words, if you were going to send it in sometime within the next few days or sometime before September 1st for coordination, please hold on that and take the opportunity to discuss the coordination and what you may be getting out of coordination on a CE level project with your NRM biology point of contact. And let's just make sure that we're coordinating things that we're more likely to receive beneficial input from TPWD on unique circumstances, unique impacts to state listed species or SGCN, something where we definitely would benefit from having that conversation with TPWD. If it is a standard CE with standard BMPs with minimal impacts to those species, then definitely hang on to it. So be happy to answer questions about that. This MOU does provide funding for a single TPWD transportation liaison that will continue to be Suzanne Walsh. And that means that she's going to be by herself doing all the coordinations for EAs and EISs. So we're hoping that will significantly reduce her workload and she can focus on those projects. And then the last thing that the new MOU does is provide funding for some jointly identified conservation actions. And that allows us to spend our time in efforts with TPWD on things that we think are going to be beneficial for both of our agencies. One example of a conservation action that we're excited about funding is some joint work with the Botanical Research Institute of Texas to help us with protocols and set up kind of a prearranged situation for them or other groups to assist TxDOT with seed collections or plant relocations for SGCN plants, rare plants, what have you, because that is a need that we seem to have on a pretty regular basis, and sometimes it's very difficult to find the right folks to assist with that. So having that kind of pre-prepared and in place so it's ready when we need it. That's one type of action. All right. So again, just to reiterate, that is coordination is going to be required for environmental assessments and environmental impact statements. Categorical exclusions will be coordinated at the district's discretion. The Tier 1 form will be going away, and we will have some new forms that will be replacing, and also some of the forms that we've been using, the species analysis form. Matt's going to go over that right now. That will have some changes that reflect the new MOU.
Yeah, so it's a pretty exciting change, I think, and to sort of be able to communicate this change, we needed to update our species analysis form. So I'm just going to give y'all a sneak peek at the new form here. This came out in that same email that had all of the guidance documents. Once again, just caveating that this is a draft as it stands, but it's not likely that there's going to be much change to this, and it should. We're hoping to get all these uploaded, and depending on how quickly the toolkit keepers can get them posted, hopefully in the next couple of weeks here, all this stuff will be at your fingertips in the toolkit. But the change here, you'll notice under this TPWD coordination section of the form, there's no longer mention of the maintenance EA. So the maintenance EA is no longer a relevant resource for TPWD coordination. Instead, our first question here is asking, does this project requires environmental assessment or environmental impact statement, and therefore must be coordinated with TPWD? So coordination is required for these documentation types. If that's your scenario, you check this first box. The second box notes that this project is a CE, and therefore coordination with TPWD is not required. However, it will be coordinated with TPWD under the MOU at the TxDOT district's discretion. So when we're talking about at the discretion, really, we're thinking there should be a good mutually beneficial reason to do this. So there's no reason to be sending all of your CEs over to TPWD to review. We really only want to send the ones we can get some value out of. So if there is, for example, if you know there's a particularly sensitive or rare important resource, and maybe you'd like to get some guidance from TPWD on how to address that. If you have a situation where you need mitigation and you don't have a bank available, so you might go the PRM route. Maybe this could be an opportunity to reach out to TPWD and let them know, hey, we need this type of mitigation. Are there any opportunities that y'all are aware of? Any chances for partnership? That kind of thing. So really, these are really only scenarios that we're going to want some good input from TPWD. And then this final checkbox, which will hopefully be the majority of your projects. This project is a CE, therefore coordination with TPWD is not required and will not be coordinated with TPWD. So those are your three checkboxes here. Note that once again, the Tier 1 site assessment is going away. That document was a tool to communicate our requirements based on the 2013 MOU. Since the 2013 MOU will be going away, there's no need to be utilizing that Tier 1 site assessment after September 1st. Also going away will be that vegetative community threshold programmatic agreement that was associated with that 2013 MOU. So we're no longer utilizing EMST and things like that to determine whether or not a threshold trigger was met exceeding impacts to a certain community type. We'll still continue to use EMSC as a tool, as a planning tool to determine what types of communities might be out there, if any rare communities might be out there, things like that. But we're no longer using it to determine thresholds for coordination with parks. And here at the bottom of that section, we just draw your attentions to the fact that any project that will be coordinated should complete this documentation of TPWD BMP practices, or the BMP form. And we'll go over that form in just a moment here. And that for any information regarding TPWD coordination, see our new guidance document, TPWD coordination, under the 2021 MOU. And so those are the changes to the species analysis form. And I just want to pass it back to Clover for a second to kind of go over what the actual process is going to look like for those projects that do require coordination or that are coordinated at our discretion.
All right. So if you do need to coordinate, in other words, you have a project that is an EA or EIS, or if you're choosing to coordinate for a CE, I'm going to refer to this as the Texas two-step. It's a two-step process. It is meant to be a collaborative process. And the first step is called initial collaborative review. And that's where we're going to be providing them TPWD with information early on in the project. So we will want to start this step as soon as possible once the species analysis and surface water analysis have been completed and that documentation is available in ECOS. We do use ECOS primarily for TPWD reviews. That's so you don't have to send them copies of the documents. They can log into ECOS directly using the CSJ and referring them to whichever files they are going to be needing to review, and any maps or other information that might be helpful for them. And that's what they're going to be primarily looking at, is the documentation in ECOS. We'll go over this, the documentation of best management practices form in just a second, but that is going to be the information that we transfer to TPWD, and that's what replaces our tier 1 form, essentially to communicate to them, this is what we think the impacts are going to be. These are the BMPs that will be applied to the project as we know it, and it'll give them the opportunity to see that we've performed some analyses, we understand what our impacts are going to be, and also offer their input. And this initial collaborative review process is started by sending TPWD an email, essentially to initiate this step. So it mimics the previous coordination process, but this is just the first step. So the goal of this initial collaborative review is to make sure that we're going to give them the opportunity to look at the project and that we can benefit from any recommendations or information provided by TPWD as early as possible in the collaborative review process before the environmental document is produced. And that's going to help save time in the EIS process. So step 2 is the actual coordination of that draft EA or EIS. And the goal here, if we do that initial collaborative review, gather all their comments and make sure that we have included that information in the EA or EIS, incorporate that into the draft document. We then provide TPWD the NOA, our notice of availability, for that EA or EIS, and they will go check it out, make sure that their information has been incorporated, and hopefully they won't have any extra comments, but if they do, then we need to respond to their comments in writing, address any additional concerns that they may raise, and then we will include any commitments that we have made to TPWD, BMPs, what have you, in that final EA, EIS, and of course those will also be recorded in ECOS. So again, the goal at the very beginning, give them the information for the project, gather that information and input back from them, incorporate that into that draft environmental document, make sure that that's done well, and hopefully that will minimize their commenting, or they may say they have no comments, and that process will go rather smoothly. So that's our hope. And the form that's going to support that coordination is what's up next. So I'm going to send it back to Matt.
Thanks, Clover. And I just want to add that the TPWD MOU guidance that we had also attached, once again, yesterday, that goes over both of these steps in detail and what types of documentation should be included, what the associated timelines are, and things like that. All that information can be found in that guidance document. So I want to give you all a sneak peek at this new documentation of TPWD BMP form. I'm going to just pull that up here. And basically, the reason we're creating this is that as part of the MOU, Texas Parks and Wildlife is creating a new list of BMPs for us. So they are, as we speak, working on a document that will include a variety of best management practices. Now, many of these will be similar to those that are in the current BMPPA. A lot of those are going to keep, moving on. But they're also working with all of their species leads and other experts in their department to develop some new ones. That information is forthcoming. And just to kind of get into the thought process here for our CE projects and things like that, while we're not required to coordinate with TPWD, our expectation is that we will still be assessing and evaluating impacts to state protected species and SGCN and implementing these BMPs on our CE level projects and just making that decision internally and implementing them where we can and as often as we can. So we're not kind of sending that information to TPWD. We're not coordinating any of that stuff, but we're still going through the motions, so to speak. We're still determining those impacts, and we're still recommending and implementing BMPs for those species in every scenario that we can. So just to give you guys a look here at the new form, it's got all your basic, your standard form information here at the top. And then we have a statement that's basically directing TPWD to that email that was sent in that initial collaborative review phase that lists all the different file names. So the file names of the species analysis spreadsheet, the surface water analysis form.
Matt, can you go to page width?
I can indeed. The NDD documentation, all that stuff. So that's why it's important to have good file names and to provide those file names to TPWD in that email so they can know where to go to find out what resources would be impacted. And then there's just a handful of questions here to help Parks and Wildlife better understand impacts to resources that they're interested in. So you have a question here about impacting state parks, WMAs, wildlife refuges, or any other protected land. You have a question that asks if we need any assistance from TPWD to help with mitigation options. You have an open-ended question here if your project has some particular issue related to a resource or a species that we would like some input and assistance from. So this is really, this is a way for us to reach out to them and say, hey, we know we've got this here. We know that y'all got some good ideas. Let's talk about it. So you can just put that information in this kind of open-ended box here. And this question 4 here is where we will be listing the BMPs from Parks and Wildlife once we receive them. So basically, you're just going to run down this list of different BMPs and check off the ones that apply to your project. And this just communicates to Parks and Wildlife that we've put the thought into this process, and these are the BMPs we're agreeing to. And then we have another question here that includes some of our specifications. So it's a slow-going process, but we are in the process of converting many of these BMPs into statewide specifications that can be utilized. So we already have the amphibian reptile exclusion fence spec. We are very near getting a statewide bat house and bat exclusion system, getting those specifications. We're working on bird exclusion specifications related to wildlife-friendly erosion control blankets and things like that. These are things in the works that'll be coming out, sometime down the line, and will be added to this list as they become available. And we wanted to put this in here because these are probably the best, easiest ways to communicate these commitments to contractors. So folks actually doing the construction, these are put together in language that they can easily understand, that can be easily incorporated in the plans, and that can have associated bid items with them. So that's kind of a push on our end to develop these specifications. And then this is just kind of a check for Parks and Wildlife and for us to know where in our documentation we're going to document that these BMPs will be communicated. So we're providing the information in the environmental document. We're creating a Non-Endangered Species Act commitment activity in ECOS. And then here are just, this varies a little bit district to district, but, you may, and based on the BMP itself, but you may put something in your plan sheets or on the EPIC, in the general notes, or you may, your district may have some cool, innovative way to communicate these. And if that's the case, please talk to us, because we're always looking for good suggestions to provide folks and innovative ways to communicate this information to contractors. So you'll have an option to enter your particular methodology here in the explanation box. And that's it. That's the form. So in essence, this is kind of replacing the Tier 1 form. This is the coordination specific documentation form that will be attached to every coordination with TPWD from now on. And the last thing that we want to cover here is about
Matt, if I can jump in for a second.
Yes,
Sally had a question that was basically regarding whether we're still doing the NDD. And
Yes.
Sally, the answer to that is yes. We're still doing all of the different types of analyses that we have done before. The difference is that we're not coordinating with TPWD. So rather than that being something we're generating for them to review in some kind of oversight role, we are continuing to do the analysis and generate it for our internal decision making. So this goes back to what I said earlier about TPWD being in more of a partnership role and us taking control of our own program and providing policy and guidance that will help y'all to know what the expectations are. But the short answer is yes, we're still doing NDD. Yes, we're still doing EMST, but the thresholds don't matter anymore. We're not coordinating anymore. There's no more Tier 1 site assessment. So this is a significant streamlining, but it's also a paradigm shift from the way that we've been doing business with Parks and Wildlife in the past. So all those things that we've been doing, those are tools in our toolbox, right? And so we need to utilize those tools to determine the project impacts to species and habitat. So that hasn't changed. And I hope that answers the question. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Sterling, because that's a very important point. The way that we're performing these analyses is really business as usual, and there's just a change kind of on our interaction with our sister agency here. I want to get into the last kind of component of the MOU, which is recoordination. And really the first trigger, so to speak, for recoordination is the project subject to a NEPA reevaluation? So if it is, then and if it's an EA or EIS, then we're going to kind of go through this process to determine whether or not it needs to be recoordinated. Now CEs, whether they are after September 1st and the new MOU applies, or they were coordinated under the 2013 MOU, recoordination for those projects is optional. So that's at the district's discretion. There's no requirement to recoordinate CE projects anymore, only these EA projects, EAEIS projects. So if your project is subject to a NEPA reeval, then the next question to ask is, are there new impacts that were not included in that previous coordination, or an increase in impacts to any terrestrial or aquatic state listed species or their habitat? So if you have new impacts or an increase in previously coordinated impacts, then you're going to recoordinate. And the next question is, are there any plant communities now, new records within the project area that have a record in the NDD in that database, or that have a state rank or a rank range that's S1, S2, or S3, so somewhere in there. And this kind of information can be found in a variety of sources. The best is the Texas Conservation Action Plan, and you can actually Google SGCN plant communities, and it comes up with a spreadsheet that you could download that spreadsheet and look at those. But a lot of this information will be included in the guidance documents and kind of how to make some of these determinations. And once again, if you're stuck on any of these steps, we are here to help. So please reach out to your assigned biologist or to the bio team. And the next trigger is, are there new or increased impacts to riparian habitat and or water? Previously you weren't doing any work in or adjacent to the water, now you are, then you're going to need to re-coordinate. And the last is, are there any change to commitments made during the previous coordination, including the BMPs we agreed to? So if for whatever reason there's a project change, or the constructability, there was an issue with that and we're no longer able to implement some of these BMPs, then we're going back and we're talking to parks. But once again, this is for EA and EIS level projects or for CEs at the district's discretion. And that's really what we have for today. I just want to draw your attention one more time to the guidance documents. Feel free to start reading through those, familiarizing yourselves with them. Like I said, they are drafts. We're not making any warranties as to their contents just yet, but it is anticipated they're not going to change much. So it's a good starting point to kind of become familiar with these new requirements and these new processes.
Thanks, Matt. Matt, we got another question. This is from Keith Bradley. He wants to know if the MOU applies to aviation division projects. And the answer to that is yes. The MOU is between TxDOT and TPWD. It does not have any kind of tie to FAA or FHWA. So if aviation division would like to avail themselves of the streamlined MOU that we have, then that's fantastic. If not, you just have to get in line like any other developer. So I recommend that aviation reach out to us and we'd be happy to assist.
Yeah, thank you, sir. And yeah, that applies to really any division that would have environmental documentation associated with it. Barbara, to answer your question, so I'm not sure if we're talking about CEs or what here, but basically, if you have a CE project and you've prepared a tier 1 and have not submitted it, please do not submit it to parks. Apologies for extra work in creating the tier 1, but your project timeline is going to be longer if you submit it now. And we're also going to needlessly increase Parks' workload when they're getting ready for this transition. If it was an EA, if at all possible, I would also please ask that you wait till September 1st and just go ahead and complete that BMP form instead. I guess if there is like an extreme time crunch on here, then talk to us. If you need to submit this for an EA or EIS right away, we could kind of evaluate that on a case-by-case basis. But yeah, for CE projects, if you're developing a tier 1, my guidance to you is to stop developing that documentation and do not coordinate, do not send it in. And if you really, really want some parks input, wait till September 1st and handle it that way.
And just to jump in real quick, to complete that, will you need to redo the documentation to the new standards? If this is a CE level project that you have completed documentation for and you're using the current version of the species analysis spreadsheet, you've done all the things that you would normally do to complete that species analysis spreadsheet, then there's no change. The only thing that would be different is the need to use the new species analysis form that has a different set of checkboxes. And that's, you would file all of the documentation that you've already created in ECAS the same way that we've done in the past, and then use the new species analysis form to indicate that coordination is no longer necessary if this is a CE level project. Does that answer the question, Barbara? And
there's a couple of questions on timelines, but I want to jump down to Chris's question, Chris Kloss.
Thank you.
Chris, do everything the way you have been doing it. Yeah, for everything, unless you get an agreement from NRM that a particular project can be waived because it fits into that category of no conceivable biological impacts, then yeah, just keep doing what you're doing. Just losing the tier 1 form, losing the thresholds, and then adding these 2 new forms for coordination. So there you
And
go. And then Clover, if you want to talk about the timelines.
yeah, and just to add on a little bit to why we need to keep doing the analysis, again, that speaks to that trust and the processes that we have in place to look at our own projects and determine whether there will be impacts. And that's, we can't do that if we're not doing all the analysis that we've always done. So we still need to look at EMST. We still need to look at NDD. We still need to do a species analysis spreadsheet because there's that documentation still needs to occur for a CE level project. It just does not have to go to Parks to get their blessing.
Yeah,
We
and part of
still
the reason,
do the work.
yeah, part of the reason that I think Parks was willing to relinquish their review of CEs is because they're happy with how we were reviewing these projects. They were happy with this process, and they said, okay, y'all are doing a good job. We trust you to keep doing that. So if we change, the way that we're doing that, their opinion may change in the future. So we want to keep it up. We want to keep kind of holding ourselves to the highest standard of review and documentation. And, things will only improve from here if we can do that.
To that end, the same thing applies for BMPs, in as much as it makes sense to apply a BMP to a project. If you're going to have a certain taxa in the project area, or there are things that we should be doing on CE level projects to minimize those impacts, then do them. Put them in the project documentation, put them in the EPIC, put them in the non-ESA commitments activity in ECOS. Those are still appropriate to use. Those are still appropriate to apply. They're still protective of the species. So keep doing that where it is applicable. All right. And I'm going to go back and catch up with some of these questions on timeline. Okay, there's a couple of different questions. One from Shelley Eason. Are there limitations on the time it will take for coordination? And then there's another one from Christopher Toller. Does the anticipated turnaround time for TPWD coordination stay the same under the NMOU? What is the turnaround time? Okay, so as far as initial collaborative review, that's going to be project specific and project dependent. There is no specified turnaround time on that, but we don't anticipate that many EAs or EISs that are going in for TPWD review. And a lot of it's going to depend on how complicated the project and how well done the documentation is. So if it's a straightforward project and the documentation's well done, I imagine the TPWD will review it quickly and comment. So if it's a really complicated one and it requires a lot of conversation and back and forth with TPWD, or there's something specific we need their assistance with, then that initial collaborative review process may take a little bit longer. So that was not designed to have any kind of specified timeline. The timeline is associated with that step 2. And that is that's a statutory timeline that's spelled out in our regulations and TPWD's regulation in terms of we have to submit to them the notice of availability of the environmental document no less than 45 days before we make a decision. But again, this is not something we need to be doing at the last minute. This is something that we need to be in conversation with them all along so that nothing is a surprise and everything is very straightforward leading up to that environmental decision. So I hope that answers your question. There's nothing specified. Again, we're hoping to significantly reduce the amount of projects that are being coordinated with TPWD so that they can focus on the projects that are more likely to have an impact. And as far as how things go through time, I think it's going to be a lot of communication back and forth between district environmental staff and also with us at ENV to make sure that things are moving smoothly, that things are not getting held up. If there is a need to rearrange or prioritize, that will come from E&V the way that it always has. And we will work directly with TPWD to make sure that things are going well. Okay.
All right. Well, Chris had another question, which was, what about projects that didn't need a tier one previously? And by that, he means ones that fall under the quote unquote maintenance exemption. And my answer to that is all projects required analysis of impacts to species. The ones that qualified under the maintenance exemption didn't need a tier one because they didn't need to be coordinated. Now, no CE needs to have a tier one. No CE needs to be coordinated. So you still have to do all the rest of the stuff. The only thing that's changed again is the coordination aspect. And I will also say that the maintenance EA has not disappeared. It is currently undergoing a reevaluation, and in that process of the reevaluation, we're looking at streamlining the BMPs that were needed to be implemented for maintenance projects. But just like the old maintenance EA, it still has a kick out that says if you have endangered species issues, then you need to be talking to E&V so that we can figure out how to handle those. So the answer to your question is, Chris, yes, every project, unless it is specifically exempted through the process where we have a conversation with E&V and we decide that it's an extremely minor project, then every project needs to be analyzed for impacts to biological resources. And hopefully that answers the question.
Do we have any other questions? Feel free to type in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask.
Yeah, now's the time to just let us know. Okay, so Barbara's got a question about the documentation that's required in ECOS for CE level projects that don't require coordination. I believe that's spelled out in the guidance that draft guidance for species analysis that was attached. Matt, I don't know if you have that open, but I don't know that it's any different than what we've had previously.
Yeah, it's really no change, and that'll be in the guidance, and that'll be in the environmental guide too. But it's really the same, just no tier one. Yeah, so I think that the only thing that's really changing is that we're not completing a tier one, and so we're not including that tier one as an ECOS upload. And so we're talking CEs here, and then for EA EIS, you're instead of a tier one, you're completing that BMP documentation form. Megan, your question here about any additional requirements for documenting discrepancies between EMST observed and mapped, there really are no requirements for that. I think it's a good practice to do, because if we're, it just kind of records our thought process if we are saying that there's something different out there than what the EMST is telling us. But yeah, that was something that was reported to TPWD before under that vegetation EA programmatic agreement. So yeah, there's no requirement we're not reporting that information to Parks and Wildlife anymore. There won't be any questions about that in any of the forms or anything like that.
But I'd go on to say that, if you look at the species analysis, I mean, the habitat assessment guidance, that mapping your vegetation types is part of that guidance. And so we know that depending on where you are in the state, the probability that EMST is correct ranges somewhere between 50% and 90%. So knowing what your actual impacts are from a district or department standpoint is still important. It's just that they're not going to trigger some kind of threshold under the old MOU. So not required, but definitely a best practice. And you could see how you might make a decision one way or the other based on the project type.
And same thing with the figure. So again, it's one of those that it's not a requirement to put an EMST figure in ECOS. However, if you are, especially if you're coordinating an EA or EIS or even a CE with TPWD, it may be something that they would like to see and that they may ask for. So it makes sense just to go, I mean, if you're looking at the data, go ahead and just include that information.
Yeah, I would recommend uploading any analysis that you do. Go ahead and upload it. So yeah, I think that there's not going to be like a requirement to have a separate EMST discrepancy table or anything like that. But if we've done the analysis, I think it's important that we put it in there for whatever reason. If someone comes to look at it, the more information, the more background information that's provided that can help um, provide kind of lay out a pathway to how we came to our decision, the better.
Well, and you know, I think you're really talking from the TxDOT perspective and the district perspective, Matt. But I think we think about it from Megan's perspective, what's going to be required. We're going to specify that in the work authorization. If we want you to generate discrepancy tables or observed versus mapped EMST maps, we're going to say that in the work authorization, and just follow that.
All right. There is a question a little further back that we didn't capture yet. I believe it was, may a NEPA finding be issued if coordination is not complete? Are you, Shelley, I'm guessing you're talking about it for an EA or an EIS? Okay. So for an EA or an EIS, we have to submit to TPWD no less than 45 days before a decision is made on the environmental document, the notice of availability. If TPWD does not comment within that time frame, then we can move forward. They have that time frame. So, you know, as long as we're paying attention to time frames, and again, recommending that we go through that two-step process, the initial collaborative reviews, so we've captured all their information, and the actual submission of that NOA, then that's what's required. So yes, an environmental decision can be reached if we have done everything we're supposed to do. All right, any other questions? And again, we're happy to continue to answer questions here. I know this is a pretty significant departure from what we've been doing for the last 9 years. So I'm sure this will be a bit of a learning curve for all of us as we move forward. Thank you for your patience as we continue to get this guidance out and get it finalized so that we're all ready to move forward under the new MOU. That's a good question, Christine. Well, Christine's question, when do we anticipate that TPWD will provide the new BMP list that they're working on? Well, we were hoping we would have it before now, but alas, that's not the case. I can tell you that it is not significantly different from the current BMP PA. What it does do is look at BMPs from a more general perspective, things that can be applied broadly, that are more topical or more taxa wide, and then it kind of drills down into species specific. It's a little less species specific than the current BMPPA. So, and of course we've got TxDOT specifications that can be added on top of that. But so that our current guidance is please continue to look at the current BMPPA. We're not going to take that off the toolkit until we have something new to provide you guys from TPWD. All right. Again, we're going to get this information out to everybody. We'll provide a copy of this presentation. We have recorded the presentation and we're hoping to be able to post that up to YouTube, and we'll send that link out to everybody. The draft guidance that you have all been provided, we're hoping that that is pretty close to what it's going to end up being. And we will let you know when all of that will be published to E&V's toolkit. If you have needs or specific project questions, please reach out and we will help navigate this new process.
And I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat box, so I'd just like to say thank you for everyone for taking your time to attend. We had about 100 people today. We had about 100 people yesterday. So that's both internal to TxDOT and external. So I couldn't be happier with the turnout, and thank you very much.
Yes, thanks everyone. And please reach out with any questions after this. And we look forward to getting this new MOU implemented.